Hello and welcome to this week's Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be discussing could we be heading for energy blackouts this winter as the government is drawing up emergency plans to potentially ration electricity use come the winter. And in this programme I'm joined by Melanie Symonds, who's the editor of Heart newspaper, together with the Reverent Mark Weeden from Living Word Ministry. So welcome back to the programme, guys. Of course, a new edition of Heart newspaper is out, so I'll give you an opportunity to unpack it. But before I do, just let you know, our own Gordon Petty is doing a book review in Heart newspaper, where he's done an excellent review of...
It's his own book.
Of his own book. There you go. CC Stud. There you go. Gordon writes so many books.
Gentleman
he's prolific.
cricketer, yes.
There you go. So he's done a review on his own book, which is great. But what else can our viewers expect to see in this edition of Heart newspaper?
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Well, we've have Her Majesty on the cover, and Charles Gardner's written a lovely piece about the Queen's faith, and then we're also dealing with the thorny question of Prince Charles and defender of faith, and sort of laying that one to rest, because I actually saw a letter that he'd written to someone calling it this an irritating misapprehension. So he's heartily sick of that, basically. We've got slightly more prophetic element this time. We've got we have the usual prophecy today supplement, and we've got a piece about prepping in a very practical way. People are stocking up, and also some recent prophecies as well. So yes.
Okay.
And we've got a wonderful Halloween testimony, I will just say that actually, which is quite important, about a new woman who's into the New Age, very much into the New Age, and then she has been radically became a Christian and has had quite a lot of deliverance. And Pastor Mark has also written a piece on Halloween and the dangers as we head up to the 31st of October.
There we go. So that's all of the Heart newspaper for the next 2 months. So thank you for that. And Mark, it's great to see you on the programme. And what are your thoughts on this interesting topic that we could be facing energy blackouts this winter, the first time since the 3-day week of the early 70s, I think back in 73 before I was even born. So it's extraordinary to think that 2022, we're in a time and an age where we can no longer meet our own energy demands. Who would have thought it possible?
It is quite extraordinary. I mean, I do vaguely remember 1973 and the darkness there, particularly at school, them having to struggle to kind of keep things alight or keep us occupied. But in this 21st century, and we are probably the 5th biggest economy in the world, and at a time of history when the economies, no one has ever been as prosperous as we are. We've got the infrastructure, we've got the understanding, we've got all these things, and yet we're facing this. There are some, I think, quite searching questions that need to be asked to explore why we're at this place. And that some people might get a little upset by some of those questions, actually, but how do we really explain it? And I think the consequences are perhaps going to be greater than people realise, because they've not engaged with this. Not just for ourselves, but you think of continental Europe and especially Germany. And Germany, of course, is the economic motor for Europe, and that will affect everyone in Europe. So very serious indeed, I think.
Absolutely. Melanie, what do you think, this is according to the Current Affairs publication, The Week, that millions of UK households could face power rationing this winter, according to the worst case scenario drawn up by officials in Whitehall in response to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which is one element of this energy crisis. But I mean, who could have think that in the UK that we could actually have energy rationing? Even talking about, for example, electricity could be turned off at weekdays and peak times in the morning between 7 and 10 a.m. and then in the evenings between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. So most people will be sitting in darkness with nothing to do, won't they?
They could be, yes. I mean, I think, wasn't this drawn up in May, this forecast? Now, according to Janet Daly in the Telegraph the other day on the 9th of October, she said that was the National Grid managed to get an avalanche of coverage for a potential wave of winter power cuts that it admitted was based on a worst-case scenario and unlikely to happen. this announcement was obviously designed to encourage people to use less energy, which, being British and responsible and want to save their own money, they would have done anyway. And we now know that Liz Truss refused to let her government go down that road. And Janet Daly says she finds it hard to believe that she's done for. So it is possible we could have these power cuts. We just don't know, and they needed to draw that up and get people to think about it. But what we're also seeing, as Pastor Mark pointed out, is a long-term lack of planning by successive governments. And whatever way it works out, whether they give us cuts or not, they are digging deep into the public purse to bail us out, to bail themselves out, so they look good politically. Also in the Telegraph, on the 17th of September, Tony Lodge was saying we need a public inquiry into this energy disaster because he's highlighting long-term lack of planning. Years of ministerial dithering alongside bad planning has helped deliver the perfect storm. And so we see this awful brinkmanship now. We just don't know. There could be power cuts. I remember 1973. I was born then. Of course, when at that age, you don't sort of take things terribly seriously. But it is extremely precarious. We just, yeah.
Absolutely. Mark, what I find kind of extraordinary about this all is that we may be facing, power shortages, energy blackouts come December, according to Whitehall officials, and this is the kind of worst case scenario. But of course, you mentioned Germany, but it's far worse on the continent of Europe. And to think that this could cause major problems across Europe, and with this potential energy crisis just coming on the back of COVID-19, these sort of crises are enough to cause even kind of revolutions, aren't they?
Yes, there have been times of civil unrest when people have been affected economically. I mean, it's happened here in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, and I think a little bit with Ted Heath as well in that winter of discontent. It's happened in France not too many years ago with the Yellow Vests, and of course it's happened in Latin America too. That may not touch us so much, and people may not register with that point, but it's the same principle of when people are stretched economically. So you think of the elderly, the vulnerable, who are choosing between heating and eating. But if you think of early morning power cuts, 7 o'clock, people going to work, or even harder, getting children to school, getting them ready and out. I mean, that's tough enough for most parents as it is. That's actually going to be a major thing, even more than the evenings, I think. The evenings will be dark and depressing, but the mornings will be a real challenge to have some kind of normalcy of life. And we've already had 2.5 years disrupted, especially for the children. So actually, the consequences are really quite widespread. In terms of children, emotion, mental issues, as well as all the economics and the disruptions.
And I remember a couple of weeks ago that our former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was attacking Tony Blair and previous Labour governments, but he failed to attack David Cameron and also Theresa May for the lack of energy planning. And one part of this was that they haven't built enough nuclear power stations to meet the electrical demands. But the truth of this is a combination of the war in the Ukraine and the fact that the Russians are stopping the supply of gas because Russia is the largest supplier of natural gas. That is one aspect. The other aspect is that we've dumped reliable energy sources, and now we've turned to renewable energy resources such as wind and solar, which, considering that we sometimes don't get much wind in this country, and sometimes we only in the winter, and we certainly don't get much sun in the summer, and depend upon these as our main sources of energy in this country, it's kind of madness, isn't it? We're pursuing this policy of zero net emissions is doing massive economic and also social damage to our society and to our nation.
Yes, and it's not really getting a lot of publicity, except in fairly densely written articles like the one that I was referring to. We've got this situation, as you say, about the wind turbines back in the summer, when oddly enough there wasn't very strong winds, and then we had the heat wave and everyone had their air conditioners on, and the National Grid had to panic buy staggeringly expensive Belgian electricity to avoid power cuts then. And as power demand surged during the heat waves, the national grid paid £9,724 per megawatt hour, more than 5,000% the typical price, to prevent London suffering blackouts. Now, that should be headlines, that the government is squandering our money from lack of planning, but they don't own up. So you've got people like Putin and President Xi in China who got themselves elected for life, or Putin's more, or President Xi is about to be, and Putin's more or less got himself in that position, and they can plan for the long term. And everyone, they have a parliament which rubber stamps what they want, and they can have energy plans. And of course, China used to be building loads of power stations, but we were shutting them to meet EU demands. And now apparently we are trying to reinvigorate 50-year-old power stations to sort of crank them up, to press them back into service, because politically, never mind, the actual aims of meeting net emission targets, politically it's really bad for any government if they cannot keep the lights on. And this is what I am actually really concerned for Liz Truss. She's having a bumpy ride at the moment. There has been some political naivety on show. She had good ideas, but it wasn't properly presented. The way wasn't paid, or the finance issues. But it takes me back to 1973. Edward Heath, the government fell because he presided over that. But my only consolation is that Edward Heath had not helped Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. He refused to let American jets refuel here. They ended up, no one in Europe did. They ended up in Portugal. They were the only ones to let them in. And the Lord doesn't forget that, and I don't know if the Lord forgives it either, but let people repent. There has been some repentance on behalf of that anyway a while ago. But my only consolation is that Liz Truss does have good relationships with Israel, gets on well with Yair Lapid, they're both, foreign ministers at the same time, and she does want to move the embassy. And Pastor Mark made a comment about that the other day because he saw the flack that she was getting.
Yeah. Mark, on that one, I think it's also important to remember that was also the kind of OPEC embargo, first time that the Arab world was using flexing its political muscles over the oil embargo, which really brought Europe and the West to its knees, and certainly changed European foreign policy to favour that of the Arabs, so that we don't get in this situation again. But I'm also reminded pretty much of reading about from the World Economics Forum's Global Reset in 2020, and how they kind of planned kind of the energy crisis and energy blackouts, and saying that after COVID-19 we're going to cause environmental disruption, and the next big thing on this One World Government agenda is to have energy blackouts, and you call it really good. You've actually termed the phrase very, very well, and that is a situation that we are facing now, where this seems to be actually deliberate rather than accidental.
I think that's a very important point you raised, that we do need to look at powers behind the throne. What are the real forces that are making things happen? And I wonder that we're being prepared to have blackouts. And so when we're told about worst case scenarios, and of course they'll never happen because it's just a worst case, they're paving the way that we're going to have something. And this whole issue isn't just a lack of planning. We've got very intelligent people in the system. We've got to consider not just the politics and the economics, the fact that there's a war in the Crimea, in Ukraine, but it's the whole green agenda and how are they pushing to get what they want in that. And so energy lockdowns, I think, are probably a strategy. We have wondered that there would be economic lockdowns of some sort after the COVID lockdowns. And so this is one way of doing that. It's a bit more subtle, but it gets to the same end. And so I think that area does need to be explored.
Absolutely. So let's, unusual for politics today, but CBN have produced this excellent news report about Europe's energy crisis. And this does explain so much of what's happening, not only in Britain, but also on the continent of Europe as we head for a winter with possible energy blackouts.
Some Europeans are so angry over sky-high energy bills, they're burning them. Others are starting to gather firewood for winter. These are some of the wealthiest nations in the world, and yet citizens are wondering if they're going to be able to heat their homes when the weather turns cold. London's mayor is warning that millions won't be able to afford food or heat this winter.
We're at prices which are 10 to 15 times the 10-year average. People can't afford to pay that much for their energy bills.
Europe's closure of hundreds of power plants in favor of wind and solar and its decision to rely on Russia for 40% of its natural gas have backfired badly. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines from Russia to Germany are both offline now after being rocked by an explosion last week, what is suspected to be sabotage. Germany was warned repeatedly by then-President Donald Trump that it was making a big mistake by turning to Russia for energy, including this speech at the United Nations in 2018.
Germany will become totally dependent on Russian energy if it does not immediately change course.
Germany's UN delegation appeared to laugh at Trump's warning. They're not laughing in Germany now. Dr. Holger Thus in Germany is the president of the European Institute for Climate and Energy.
It's crazy. Everybody's afraid of the upcoming winter. And nobody really knows what's going to happen. And nobody also knows where the energy is going to come from.
Businesses across Europe that can no longer afford their monthly energy bills are shutting down. The value of the euro and the British pound have dropped dramatically. And despite an energy crisis that has turned into an economic crisis, European nations are continuing to close and dismantle nuclear reactors. 10 years ago, Germany had 17 nuclear reactors. It's decided to keep only 2, and only as backups. America should learn a lesson from Europe's energy crisis. But the Biden administration seems to be going down the same road. The White House wants America on 100% green energy in just 13 years. And congressional Democrats continue to pressure banks to stop funding the oil and gas industry.
Answer with a simple yes or no. Does your bank have a policy against funding new oil and gas products? Mr. Diamond.
Absolutely not, and that would be the road to hell for America.
It has certainly been the road to economic hell in Europe, which is now bracing for a winter of social unrest. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
And just a lack of forward thinking and planning and to realise that renewable energy doesn't meet our energy demands, and if we face the prospect of energy blackouts this winter, is going to have a severe political impact, particularly on our current government. Melanie, what I'm concerned about the most, though, as well, is if they're thinking that this could happen sometime in December, and if the energy lights go, if the energy goes off, and we are then rationed with our use of electricity in the darkest period of the year. Also, there's a World Cup taking place in Qatar as well. This is not going to go down at all well with the electorate. So could we see that that this could lead to so much unrest and so much unease within our country that we could see that the Conservatives could be booted out of office for a generation, if not more?
That is a concern. There has been a prophecy which we got in this issue of the paper: the government will fall. We know that we can pray to avert these things. It is a serious warning. There is a concern that Keir Starmer is being talked about. People say he's not very exciting, but he could be seen as a safe pair of hands. But of course, if Labour come into power, they're always going to be just printing more money. But this is what the Conservatives have been doing. There hasn't been clear blue water. And my big concern is that there's been this creep of cultural Marxism, which someone like David Curtin talks about a lot, and the people who are thinking in this way of like a sort of socialism, really, they are in the institutions now, and they are thickly in the broadcasting media. And that's why they made all this fuss about Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, because there is a sort of creeping socialism in public opinion now. They've made sure that it's there. And this is my concern, that Boris is freely spending money, so was Rishi, will do whatever it takes. And so now there's been a mentality developed in the people, the British people probably around the world, that the government is going to look after them. And this really is the road to slavery. There's a huge concern there, because people might then just turn to any government that is going to, quote, look after them and not tell them things as it is.
In other words, state control and
Yes.
more state control over our lives. I don't want to alarm our viewers watching this programme today with the prospect that we could be facing worst case scenario energy blackouts, or as you like to term it, energy lockdowns, which is another way of looking at this potential crisis that we face coming in December and the winter months. And to think that this would be horrific, because this is the darkest period of time. This is when there's less sunlight. This is when it's cold. This is when we need our electricity and our heating. But practically, though, what can our viewers do, and how can we prepare for this? Because it's one thing talking about this at a political level, but the thing is, this could affect millions of people's lives up and down the country.
Well, one thing is to take comfort from the words of Jesus, who said, in the world you will have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world. And he said, my peace I leave you. So we can have peace in the midst of this. We can learn from the Apostle Paul, who said, I've learned to abase and to abound. And so he knew how to handle life when he had an abundance of things and also when there was a lack. And we need to make some provisions. We're realizing that not everybody is going to be able to prepare. There'll be those who simply don't have that extra fiver or extra tenner or whatever it might be. And we need to recognize as believers that we're a people who share, we're a people who consider others. I've done many mission trips to Africa, and blackouts are part of life. In fact, there's often not even water. All sorts of things go wrong. And you have to learn to be grateful for what you do have rather than what you don't have. And if we can more and more focus on the blessings that we have and have a mind for others and where we can help them, I think we can get through this together, despite the problems that may well be being orchestrated behind the scenes. But God is greater than all of that. Amen. And Jesus had said, take courage, I have overcome the world.
Amen. I mean, all it needs is a bit of common sense to apply to this situation. Common sense on behalf of our government, on behalf of Whitehall, to realise that pursuing a policy of zero net emissions is doing more damage than it is for good. Yes, every government has a duty to look after the environment, and as Christians we are told to care for the planet. I think that's essential. But when you actually bring in exports from Canada in the forms of trees and for wood chippings, and use them in power stations instead of coal, which is absolute madness, because that's exactly what coal is. It's fossilized trees. Have we in this age lost every sense of sanity and reason? And has the Lord given our leaders over to a debased mind, as it says in I think Romans 1?
Yes.
Elaborate.
Yes. Well, it's built up, hasn't it? It's the lack of long-term planning, which is now, and we've ended up in this mess. I mean, we know that the wind doesn't blow in summer, so we can't rely on wind turbines, so we should plan ahead. And we know it's going to be cold in winter, and so we ought to have some power stations that actually work. There just hasn't been the planning, how accidental it is or not. You have these wonderful ideals, ambitions to make the world carbon neutral for the future, but if people are shivering right now, they're not going to be too worried about their grandchildren are living in.
Leading them into poverty and ruin and everything else, because if the government hadn't intervened, we would be facing kind of rocket energy prices, sky-high rocket energy prices, all because of stupid government policies that they've signed up to. And we can see now why President Trump endured all the flack that he did, because he pulled out of the Paris climate accords back in 2018, I think, knowing that this would bankrupt the United States. Now, it seems absolutely strange that we would actually destroy our own civilization and bring in tyranny, because this is potentially what we're facing. We're possibly facing unease, lockdown, protests, even revolution that this could possibly cause. How important is it again that we take the warning of Paul in his letters to the I think in the New Testament, to pray for our leaders that we would have a peaceful life?
It's vital, absolutely vital, and it doesn't matter which party that you belong to or what you think of any current leader. We have to pray for them that they are given God's wisdom, that sin is restrained. If they were really serious about dealing with climate change, they'd go and talk to China and India, because we produce 1% of the problem, and if they've between them got over half of the problem. And so we're going to make no difference in those things. We need to have wise leaders, and wisdom comes from God, so it is vital.
Absolutely. And also it's important, Melanie, isn't it, to kind of speak up on these issues and not to cower to this political correctness or this woke ideology, to think that we can't even speak up on these issues and just have a rational debate on these things. And it seems that, if we are not with the woke crowd, then effectively we're not for the progressive ideas that seem to be dominating our governments and our media and our society, because this will just lead us to ruin and destitution, won't it?
Yes, climate change has become a dogma like evolution has. It's something which can't be argued with. You have to really know your stuff to say anything about it. And a lot of Christians go along with it. If we ever put in an alternative view about man-made climate change, there are one or two brave people speaking up, then we get readers who are very concerned because they believe what the BBC says, because there's still lots of Christians who believe what the BBC said. Well, I don't know, forgive me if I've said this before, but if people don't believe the BBC on the sanctity of life, on family values, how a family ideally might be according to the Bible, and on Israel, why do they believe it on their various other dogmas which are peddled? That people seem to have these sort of selective understandings. They think, oh, well, they're wrong on that, they must be right on that.
So, Melanie and Mark, thank you so much for being my special guests for this week's edition of Politics Today, and I want to thank you at home. I think this programme is a prophetic warning of what we could face come December in the winter, with the potential of energy blackouts that could potentially then lead to energy lockdowns. These are precarious times. These are difficult times. This is times that we need to pray and intercede for our government, that our government would find solutions to these problems, and that we wouldn't be sitting in darkness this winter. But we have to remember that Jesus is the light, and we need to look to him. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.